Icy gusts whipped the desolate islands of Attu and Kiska with relentless brutality as the first enemy boots stormed the beach. It marked the first time an enemy force had invaded US soil since the War of 1812, and the Japanese aimed to let the Americans know their homeland was not safe from their reach. Several Japanese bombers loomed on the horizon, launching an unprecedented raid on US Army and Navy installations at Dutch Harbor on Amaknak Island. 14 bombs rained down on Fort Mears, obliterating 5 buildings, taking the lives of 25 soldiers and wounding 25 more. A massive supply of 22,000 barrels of oil erupted into flames, throwing the small port settlement into chaos. From June 3 to 7, 1942, the small Alaskan islands were overwhelmed by a Japanese invasion force of over 2,500 soldiers. Most of the US population on these islands were Native Americans who were savagely beaten and taken prisoner. Among them were 2 non-Native Americans, Charles and Etta Jones, who managed the local radio post. In a heroic act of defiance, Charles destroyed his radio just before being captured, denying the invaders the chance to use it against US forces. Charles Jones faced brutal interrogation and was ultimately shot by the Japanese after refusing to repair his radio. The American island of Attu fell under the iron grip of the Japanese Empire. The US military couldn't stand for this. They quickly cooked up a massive operation, and 12,500 US soldiers were sent to reclaim American soil in an 18-day showdown that would become one of the most lethal and harrowing fights of World War II for all the wrong reasons. The Aleutian Islands are infamous for having some of the worst weather on Earth. The thick shroud of clouds and fog lifts only 8 days a year. These wild, treeless land masses are constantly battered by bone-chilling winds and merciless snowstorms. In 1942, they were primarily barren and unforgiving. Unalaska was the most populated island, home to Dutch Harbor, a small settlement with a minor US military base. Attu Island, in contrast, had just a tiny village with fewer than 50 residents. Isolated in the freezing, inhospitable fringes of American territory, the islands held no strategic value to Japan. However, the Americans didn't know that. Japanese strategists saw an opportunity to deceive. Perhaps the tiny islands were inconsequential, but an incursion into Alaska was a major threat US military strategists had considered for decades. Alaska was a pivotal region that connected America with Russia, and although it was considered far-fetched, a scenario where Japan attempted to capture the territory would make sense. US General Billy Mitchell told Congress in 1935, quote, "Whoever holds Alaska will hold the world. I think it is the most important strategic place in the world." Even before the Japanese entered World War II, its Imperial Navy had gathered extensive intel about the Aleutians, and the US knew this. Still, they weren't up to date with information regarding military developments on the islands. In June 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese fleet, launched an attack on Dutch Harbor. His aim was to convince the United States that the Japanese were targeting America's west coast. His true objective was to lure US ships from Pearl Harbor and strike at Midway in the Central Pacific. Yamamoto gambled that the Americans would rush to defend the Aleutians, leaving Pearl Harbor vulnerable, and realizing too late it was a ruse. He planned to ambush the US Armada at Midway and annihilate it, forcing the United States to negotiate peace and surrender the Pacific to the empire of the rising sun. Yet there was a fatal flaw in his plan. US naval intelligence had cracked the Japanese naval code, and the American defenders were ready. They knew any attack on US soil was just a distraction. US Admiral Chester A. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had learned of Yamamoto's plan in late May. He knew Vice Admiral Bushiro Hosogaya's task force was heading to the Aleutians, including 2 small aircraft carriers, 5 cruisers, 12 destroyers, 6 submarines, 4 troop transports, and numerous support vessels. Aware it was a trap, the US military let the invasion of the Aleutians proceed, focusing instead on the critical Battle of Midway. The liberation of Attu would have to wait. For his diversion to succeed, Yamamoto knew it had to be explosive and pose a genuine threat to American interests in the Aleutians. The plan was simple but ruthless: hit Dutch Harbor hard. The first wave of Japanese fighters arrived over the island at 5:45 a.m. on June 3, 1942. Just 5 minutes later, bombers followed, raining destruction upon Fort Mears. In a matter of moments, 14 bombs fell, obliterating 5 buildings and causing several casualties. The Americans were caught off guard. The United States had recently constructed Fort Glenn airfield on Amaknak Island, and its aircraft were supposed to be ready for such an attack. However, on June 3rd, communication difficulties between Dutch Harbor and Amaknak Island meant that Amaknak was unaware of the raid until the enemy planes had already returned to their carriers. Despite the initial chaos, the American forces rallied. Later in the day, P-40 fighters from Amaknak intercepted 2 Japanese reconnaissance planes, shooting 1 down. This minor victory was a glimmer of hope amidst the devastation. As the first day turned into the second, the Japanese launched another assault. At 4:30 p.m. on June 4th, 9 fighters and 17 bombers descended upon Dutch Harbor. Their target was the 3,000-ton SS Northwestern, a beached ship near Dutch Harbor dock that served as housing for civilian workers. The ship was enveloped in flames and ultimately destroyed, as was an adjacent warehouse. The devastation didn't stop there. A bomb hit a naval gun emplacement, ending the lives of 4 men. Another bomb struck an army gun, striking down 2 soldiers and wounding 2 more. 4 new steel fuel tanks containing 22,000 barrels of oil, a month's supply for Dutch Harbor, were obliterated. A naval hangar, still under construction, had a large hole punched through its roof, damaging a Catalina PBY inside. Throughout the 2 days of relentless bombing, the American defenses managed to shoot down 11 Japanese planes, but at a significant cost. 5 Army aircraft and 6 Navy Catalina PBYs were lost. The American pilots fought valiantly. During the raid on the 4th, 8 P-40s from Fort Glenn intercepted the Japanese bombers, shooting down 4 while losing 2 of their own. The aftermath of the attacks was grim. The toll for the 2-day assault was 43 lost, with another 50 wounded. The material losses were significant, and the psychological impact was profound. The Japanese had succeeded in their diversion, drawing American attention and resources away from the Central Pacific. As the smoke cleared and the fires smoldered, the Japanese carriers sailed westward to a point off Kiska Island, preparing to protect their forces landing there. The attack on Dutch Harbor was over, but it left an indelible mark on the American troops and their resolve to defend the Aleutians. Days after the air raid, on June 7, 1942, marking exactly 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Northern Army landed on Attu. The Japanese forces dug into the mountains, carving out foxholes and stashing ammunition in sheds that still litter Attu today. Days earlier, the US Army had alerted Alaskan authorities about the impending attacks, leading to the evacuation of nearly 1,000 Aleutians from villages to civilian camps on the mainland. Tragically, many perished in those camps from infections and diseases over the next few years. However, Attu village was not evacuated in time. At the moment of the Japanese assault, Attu's population included 45 native Aleutians and Charles Foster and Etta Jones, a radio operator, and his school-teacher wife. The village, nestled around Chichagof Harbor, consisted of only a few houses. The surviving Attu inhabitants were taken to a prisoner-of-war camp near Hokkaido. Many perished in captivity. Charles Foster Jones was executed shortly after capture for refusing to cooperate with the invaders by repairing his own radio. Etta Jones was taken to the Bund Hotel in Yokohama, Japan, which housed Australian prisoners of war from the Battle of Rabaul in Papua New Guinea. Afterward, Mrs. Jones and the Australian prisoners were moved to the Yokohama Yacht Club for 2 years, and then to the Totsuka prisoner camp, where they would remain until the end of the war. After the falling of the islands, many Americans were shocked to see American territory in enemy hands. Even though the Aleutian Islands were remote and mostly desolate, Japan's possession of American territory was an outrage. Attu was the first US soil invaded by a foreign force since the War of 1812. It was a propaganda victory for the Japanese, who used it to boost morale among their troops. Back in the States, the nation was furious and shocked. Without knowing the full situation, many theorized that this was just the first step in an invasion of mainland Alaska, maybe even the entire Pacific Northwest. How could the US military allow the Japanese Navy to hold American land? Despite the public outcry, American war planners knew that the invasion of the Aleutians was a diversion for the Midway attack. They paid little attention to these remote islands, which lacked the resources to launch an attack, and recognized that the limited Japanese forces could do little with the territory they had gained. The military brass was more focused on assembling forces in the South Pacific and preparing for the invasion of Europe. While the US was gearing up for a broader conflict, Japanese soldiers struggled to acclimate to the brutal Alaskan weather. They faced sudden shifts from light fog to raging 100-mile-an-hour gusts and torrential rain. Despite ample supplies from their Imperial Navy, they had to endure these harsh conditions while building bases on several Aleutian islands. Finally, in March 1943, during the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands in the Bering Sea, the US Navy managed to block Attu and Kiska, cutting off Japanese supplies and securing clear sea lanes for a counterattack. The time had come to reclaim the American land Japan had seized. In the biting cold of the Aleutians, the stage was set for a fierce and determined struggle to take back what was lost. On May 11, 1943, Operation Land Grab was launched. The US military landed 11,000 infantry on both ends of Attu. At first, the soldiers encountered little to no resistance. Adrenaline was pumping as the second wave of US troops hit the shore. They braced for gunfire but found nothing, just black muck and howling winds. Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki, the Japanese commander on the island, knew the American response would be overwhelming. With less than 3,000 defenders, his only hope lay in the mountains at the island's center. He moved his outnumbered troops inland, seeking the high ground. The US forces knew they had the numbers and firepower, but they underestimated the resolve of the Japanese soldiers. Harry Sasser, an American who landed on Attu, recalled, quote, "We were told it would be about 3 days. That would be it, but that wasn't the case. The Japanese were very tenacious fighters." The black muck was everywhere, swallowing the troops with every slogging step. Japanese snipers, hidden in the mountain fog, waited to pick off Americans crawling up the valley. The brutal weather battered the American soldiers, who found themselves ill-equipped for Attu's snow, fog, rain, and mud. Sudden storms would sweep through, hitting exposed forces with fierce brutality. The Japanese had masterfully adapted to the island's harsh climate, becoming more proficient in that speck of American territory than the US forces. They moved like ghosts in the fog, following it up and down the island. For the US servicemen, it was like trying to shoot birds out of a cloud. What was supposed to be a quick, straightforward operation turned into a nightmare. The relentless skirmishes with the Japanese were compounded by the harrowing conditions. Exposure to the Alaskan weather led to frostbite, gangrene, and trench foot, inflicting more casualties than enemy fire. Inadequate gear and food shortages added to their misery. However, numbers were numbers, and the Japanese just didn't have them. Despite their acclimation to the island's weather and formidable defenses, the battle began to take a toll. Paul Tatsuguchi, a Japanese military medic who had lived several years in the United States, described his horrifying experience tending to a growing number of injured men, fully aware there was no hope of victory. Both sides faced more than they had bargained for. The Americans were shredded by the weather and the intricate Japanese defenses, while the Japanese were slowly strangled by the overwhelming enemy force. The Americans persisted. With the support of naval and aerial bombardments against Japanese positions and new supplies and reinforcements to replace the lost and wounded, they managed to reach the high ground where most of the enemy was hiding. They cornered Yamasaki's troops, who were now running out of supplies and ammunition. Most of these soldiers adhered to the Bushido Code, traditional rules of conduct that emerged from the samurai warriors in the 12th century, where surrender was considered the utmost dishonor. So, the Japanese began pondering taking their own lives. However, Yamasaki wasn't ready to give up just yet. He devised a desperate last-ditch counterattack. His plan was to disarm the Americans, use their artillery against them, and then retreat to the hills to await reinforcements. Desperate, far-fetched, ludicrous and improbable, but it was a plan. It was their only chance to honor Japan, an honorable sacrifice on the battlefield. Of course, Yamasaki wasn't aware of the blockade at Attu and Kiska. On May 29, 1943, Colonel Yasuyo Yamasaki and his remaining troops launched one of the largest and most desperate banzai charges of the Pacific War. Their frontal assault on the American positions was a savage onslaught, cutting through US combat posts with the raw fury of men who had nothing to lose. The Americans, caught off guard, scrambled as Yamasaki's men penetrated all the way to the support troops at the rear of the US camp. The scene was chaotic and brutal. Japanese soldiers, driven by desperation, surged down from the mountains, their war cries piercing the frigid air. They clashed with American forces in a ferocious melee. Bayonets clashed with rifles and the sharp retort of gunfire echoed through the rugged terrain. Hand-to-hand combat ensued, a desperate struggle for survival in the muddy, blood-soaked ground. Despite their fierce determination, Yamasaki and his men were ultimately overpowered by superior American firepower. As defeat became inevitable, most of the Japanese soldiers chose to avoid capture. The crack of hand grenades echoed as they took their own lives, while others used lethal injections. The ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen, a stark testament to the ferocity of the battle. Out of the 2,500 Japanese troops, fewer than 30 survived and were taken prisoner. The aftermath was grim. American soldiers buried 2,351 Japanese in mass graves on Attu, with several hundred more interred in the surrounding land. The toll on the American side was also heavy. Approximately 549 soldiers were lost in action, 1,148 were wounded, and around 2,100 non-battle casualties due to the harsh weather conditions, including frostbite and trench foot. The freezing temperatures and relentless wind added to the misery, inflicting injuries that would leave lasting scars. 2 years after the Battle of Attu, Japan surrendered to the Allies, ending World War II. The brutal conflict on this remote island was but a prelude to the war's end. Much of what is known about the Japanese soldiers' experiences on Attu comes from the journal of Paul Tatsuguchi. In his last days, he wrote about the planned banzai attack, capturing the somber reality of their final moments. Quote, "The last assault is to be carried out. I am only 33 years old, and I am to die. I took care of all patients in the field hospital with a grenade." His words offer a poignant glimpse into the mindset of those who fought and perished in one of the Pacific War's most desperate battles. The Attu invasion is often referred to as the Forgotten Battle because it was largely eclipsed by the ongoing Guadalcanal campaign, as well as the major events unfolding in Europe. Military historians have long debated the strategic intentions behind the Aleutian battles. Two primary theories dominate the discussion. One theory posits that the Aleutian campaign served as a diversion during the pivotal Battle of Midway, aiming to weaken the US Pacific Fleet by drawing resources away from Midway Atoll. On the other hand, some historians theorize that the Japanese invasion of Alaska was a preemptive measure to protect their northern flank from the possibility of an American assault on the Japanese homeland. Both theories, while plausible, seem somewhat desperate and ill-informed. However, the distraction theory appears more probable given the broader Pacific conflict's timing and context. Despite the severe losses and ultimate defeat of Japanese forces, Japanese propaganda attempted to cast the Battle of Attu in a heroic light. It was portrayed as an epic tale of resistance, where Japanese soldiers were depicted as fighting valiantly against American forces on their own soil. This narrative aimed to humiliate America and inspire the Japanese population by highlighting the soldiers' determination to fight to the very end. Consequently, the Battle of Attu remains better known in Japan than in the United States. In the US, the memory of the Battle of Attu has faded over time, overshadowed by more prominent battles in the Pacific Theater and the critical campaigns in Europe. However, the significance of the battle has not been entirely forgotten. The battlefield area on Attu was designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1985. preserving the memory of the fierce conflict that took place on this remote Alaskan island. This designation ensures that the sacrifices and stories of those who fought in the forgotten battle continue to be remembered and honored.